In the previous video, we explored iterators and learned that iterators provide a standard way to access the elements of a data structure. But when it comes to writing iterators manually, it is not that easy. Generator functions were introduced just to solve this problem. But generator functions are not just iterator helpers. It is much more powerful than that. In this video, we will be exploring everything related to generator functions. So let's just create a function that creates an iterator object, and we can create the generator function equivalent of that. Here is this create iterator function which returns an iterator object. You can see that the object is having next method and it returns an object having value and done field. Now what is happening in this function? So when we execute this function, it returns this object and we can call the next method of it. When you call the next method initially, the state value is 0, so it will execute this case 0 and it updates the state to 1 and it returns this object having value 1 and done false. Now when we call the next again for the second time, then the value of state is 1 and it executes the case 1 and it returns this object having value 2 and done false. And state is updated to 2, and when we call the third time, it will come to the default state and here value is undefined and done is true. Done is true means the sequence is completed. Now if you call next again and again, it always comes to this default case and it returns this object. Now let's just execute this. So I'm calling this function and getting the iterator object on this variable. So I'm calling the next method 3 times and let's check the output. You can see that when we call the first time, value is 1, done false. Second time, value is 2 and done false. And third time, done is true, which means the sequence is completed. Now let's write a generator function to produce the same behavior. This is the generator equivalent of this function. Here, create iterator returns an iterator object. And you can see that we are handling everything manually. So when it comes to the generator function, it is only having 2 statements. A generator function is created by the function keyword followed by an asterisk character and then the function name. And inside the function body, we can use a special expression known as yield. We will learn everything about yield later. Now, let's understand that when we call a generator function, it won't execute the statements immediately. It just returns a new object known as a generator object. Now let's call this function and see what it returns and see what is inside that object. So this is the generator object. So if you open this and if you open the prototype chain, you can see that there is a method called next, which means a generator object is an iterator. Okay, which means we can call the next method with this generator. So let's try that. So you can see that when we call the next method to the generator, we get this object having value 1 and done false. You can see that the value is 1. So if you see the generator function, 1 is coming from this first yield expression. So when we have an yield expression and when we have a value to the right side of that yield expression, that value will be the value field of the returned object from the next method. Okay, let's call the next method again. Now you can see that the value is 2 and done is false. So 2 came from the second yield expression. Okay, now let's see what happens if you call it again. Now it is undefined and done is true, which means the sequence is completed. Now if you see the generator function, we only have two yield expression and we get two of those values. Now we don't have any more yield expression. And now the sequence is completed. So when we call the next method of the created generator object, it passes to the yield statement and it returns the value to the right side of the yield as the value field of the object returned from the next method. And when we call the next method again, it goes to the next yield statement and pauses the execution. Just like the async await functions that we have discussed, this function is also paused and executed later, which means when it hits the first yield statement, the execution of the function is paused and the execution context is saved before removing the execution context from the execution stack. And when we call the next method again, it uses the already saved execution context and continues its execution. From this example, you understand that how easily we can create iterators using generator functions. So here we have the create iterator function, which creates iterators manually, and we have the generator function equivalent of it, only having two statements. Now, we just looked at the generator object and we found out that this generator object is having a next method, which means a generator object is nothing but an iterator. Now let's do one more thing with this generator object. Let's use the for of loop with this generator object. Now save this and see the output. You can see that 1 and 2 is printed. Why? Why for of loop worked with generator? We just said that the generator object is a valid iterator, but for of loop, the object has to be an iterable. So the condition for iterable is different from the condition of iterator. We just see that this object is having a next method making this object an iterator. But we didn't see that it is having a symbol.iterator method, which means let's use this object. So create iterator creates an iterator object. So in this for of loop, let's use the create iterator function. So I'm calling create iterator. So it will just return an iterator object and we are using for of loop with an iterator object. Now save this and see the output and we get an error. So create iterator is not a function or its value is not iterable, which means this returns an object, but that object is not iterable. It is an iterator object. For it to be an iterable, it should have a method with the name symbol.iterator and it should return a valid iterator object. But when it comes to the generator object, it seems like it is both iterator and at the same time it is iterable. Okay, that is why it is working with for of loop. Now let's see the generator object again. So if you open this generator object and the prototype chain, you can see that we have a next method making this object an iterator. Now if you open the prototype chain further, you can see that there is a symbol.iterator method which returns an iterator object, which means in the same object we have the next method making it an iterator, and in the same object we have a symbol.iterator method making the same object an iterable. So that is one property of a generator object. Now is there any way we can do the same with this? Yes. So we are returning this object. Now this object is only having a next method making this an iterator. Now let's add the symbol.iterator method. Now this object is iterable as well as iterator. Now to produce the same iterator behavior, we can just return this. Now let's use the create iterator function in a for loop. So here, currently we are using generator, and I'm changing this to create iterator. And let me comment this, save this. Now we are not getting any errors. We are getting the same values 1 and 2 because now this object, the returned object, is both iterator and iterable. So that's the other thing about generator function. When we call a generator function, it returns an object known as generator, and generator is basically an iterator as well as an iterable. Now let's try to understand the working of generator function in depth. So here we have a generator function test and having two yield expressions. Let me add a console.log first. Okay. Now let me comment all this. Okay. Now let's just call this function test, save this, and see the output. And we are not seeing the console.log statement because, like I said, when we execute the generator function, the statements are not executed immediately. It returns a generator object. Now let's execute the next method of the generator. So when we execute the next method, the execution of the function starts, and at line number 4 we have this console.log started and it will be printed, and at line number 5 we have an yield expression. So when it meets the yield expression, the execution of this function pauses and it returns the object from the next method having the value 1 because the right side of this yield expression is 1 and the done property will be false. Okay, so let's see the output. Started is printed and the next method returns an object having value 1 and done false. Now let's execute this again. Now this time the execution starts from this post statement, which is line number 5, and the execution continues, and at line number 6 it is again having a yield expression. So the execution pauses at this stage and it returns a new object having the value 2 and done false. So value 2 and done false. Now if you execute this again, what happens is that the execution is paused at line number 6. So it starts from line number 6 and there is nothing left to be executed, and it returns an object having a value undefined and done as true. Save this. You can see that value is undefined and done as true. If you add any statements here, let's say console.log end, and let's just comment the last statement. You can see that that console.log statement is not executed yet. So when we call the second next, the execution starts from line number 5 and it pauses at line number 6 and it returns an object having value 2 and done false, and this is executed only when we call the next method again. So when we call the next method again, the execution continues from line number 6 and it gets to line number 7 and it executes this and end will be printed. Then it will return an object having value undefined and done false. Save this. And you can see that end is printed. Then it returned a value having undefined and done true. Now let's understand the yield expression. So yield is an expression, which means it evaluates to a value. When we see this expression, we would think that the yield expression evaluates to the value which is right side of the yield keyword. But that is not the case. So let me save the returned value from this yield expression into a variable, and let's try to print it. Okay, so here what happens when we call the next method, so at line number 4 we have a yield statement, so the execution pause at the line number 4, and when we call the next again, it reaches the line number 5. Okay, you can see that now value is 1 and done is false. Now if you call this next again, it reaches line number 5 and it prints the value of val1, and then it reaches line number 6 and returns an object having value 2 and done false. So let's see this. You can see that val1 is undefined, which means this yield expression does not evaluate to the value right side of it. If that's the case, we would get 1 here, but what we get here is undefined. Now let's do one thing. In the second next call, let's pass a value 10. Save this. You can see that now the val1 is printed as 10. So we get value 1 and done false when we call the next first time. And when we called the next second time, passing a value 10, we got this console.log printed 10. So let's give a different value, 15. Now you can see that 15 is printed, which means the value that we pass to the next function becomes the evaluated value of the previous yield expression. So let's look at this again. When we call generator.next, the execution is started, and since the first statement is a yield expression, the execution pauses. Execution pauses means some part of the statement is executed. That's why we are getting from this next call an object having value 1 and done false, which means some part of the statement is executed and some part of the statement is not executed yet. That happens only when we call the next call. So when we call the next again, it actually starts from line number 4. So when we call the next again, the evaluation of the yield expression completes. And if you pass any value, that value becomes the evaluated value. When we don't pass anything, that means the value that we passed is undefined. That is why the yield expression evaluates to undefined. So now when we pass 15 here, the execution continues from this statement and the yield expression evaluates to the value 15, and that 15 is saved to the variable val1, and at line number 5 we get val1. Let's do this. Okay, so here console.log val2. Okay, now here when I call generator.next 15, it prints 15 here. Okay, which means this yield statement, this yield expression evaluates to the value 15, and this is executed. And at line number 6, it pauses here and it returns an object, which means some part of the statement is executed. That's why it returns an object having value 2 and done false, and the execution paused, which means the yield expression is not yet evaluated. Okay, that happens only when we call the next again. So let me save this. You can see that we didn't see the console.log yet. Okay, now, so if you call the next method by not passing anything, which means we are passing undefined, so the execution starts from line number 6 and the yield expression evaluates to the value that we passed, which is undefined here. So val2 will be undefined. So let's save this and we get undefined printed, and the final value undefined and done is true. Now let's give a value of 20. So this 20 becomes the evaluated value of the yield expression. Now if you save this, you can see that 20 is printed. Now what happens when we give a value to the first next call? Let's give 100. So you would think that now val1 will be 100 and val2 will be 50. No, that's not the case. Because when we call, so let's check. So we are calling the next method by giving 100. So the execution is started and the execution pauses at line number 4. But this value is not used because the yield expression, even the first yield expression, is evaluated in the second next call. So whatever value that we pass to the first next call is ignored because it is not useful. So even though we are passing 100, how can it use the value 100? So it pauses at line number 4 and it returns an object having the value 1 and done false, and the execution pauses. Okay, only when we call the next call, the execution continues and the yield expression is evaluated. Okay, so 15 is the evaluated value of the first yield expression, and 20 is the evaluated value of the second yield expression. Now let's see what happens when we have a return statement inside a generator function. Return 5, and let me comment this, and we don't need this 100. Okay, so first we get value 1 and done false, and I'm passing 10 to the next. So this yield will be evaluated to the value 10, and 10 will be assigned to this variable, and we get 10 printed here. Okay, now you can call it again by passing 20, and this time what happens? This yield expression is evaluated to the value 20, and 20 is saved to this variable, and we get that value here. And we have a return statement, and you can see that the output, so we get a value 5 and done true. Till this time, when you see the returned object from next, whenever done is true, the value is undefined. But this time, value is 5 and done is true. So done true means the sequence is ended, but we have a value. So that's happened when we have a return statement inside a generator function. Okay, so if you just move this return here, these two statements are not executed. So the execution pauses at this statement, and the yield expression is evaluated to the value 10, and 10 is printed, and then it returns an object having value 5 and done as true. So let's see this. You can see that 10 is printed. Now we get value 5 and done true. Since done is true, if you call the next again, the value will be undefined and done will be always true. You can see that value is undefined and done is true, which means after the return statement, the value field will always be undefined and done field will be true. Now let's see what happens when we throw an error from inside a generator function. So here we can just throw new error. Okay. So when we call the next method first, save this. Now you can see that the error is not thrown yet because the execution is paused. At line number 4, we get the value 1 and the statement is paused. The execution is paused. Now when we call the next method with the value 10, this yield is evaluated to 10 and 10 is printed, and then at line number 6 it will throw the error. So you can see that 10 is printed, then the error is thrown. But we can add a try catch error, and we can put everything inside the try block. Save this. So the first to next call, nothing happens. We get value 1 and done false. And the second next call, passing 10, we will get 10 printed here. So the error is thrown and it goes to the catch block. So you can see that when it entered the catch block, so the statements in the catch block is executed, and after it returns an object having value undefined and done true. So which means if you call this next again and again, it always gives value undefined and untrue because an error is thrown. So anything after that is not executed. The generator object have two other methods, the generator.return and generator.throw. So let's understand generator.return. Okay. Let's call the next method first. So we get value 1 and done false. Now let's call generator.return. So when you call generator.return, so we executed generator.next first. So it returns an object having value 1 and done false, and the execution is paused at line number 5. Right. Now when we call the return, the execution continues from line number 5, but since this is a return function, it won't execute further, but it will just return an object having value undefined in this case and done as true. Done true means the sequence is over because this is a return function. Now, when you pass a value to the return function, that becomes the evaluated value of the post yield expression. So let's see, in this case, you can see that the value is undefined and done is true. So done true means if you call the next again after calling the return function, you will always get value undefined and done true. Now, when you call the return statement, you can pass a value, and that value becomes the evaluated value of the post yield expression. So in this case, we called the next method only one time. So the line number 5 statement is paused. And when we call the return, now we didn't pass anything. That's why it gets undefined. But if you just pass uh, 12, let's say 12, now the yield expression evaluates to 12 and it return an object having value 12 and done true, and nothing after that is executed, even this console.log. So you can see that value is 12 and done is true. And any next call after that gives you a value undefined and done is true. So this is generator.return. Now let's understand generator.throw function. So we have the generator object here and we are calling the next method. So when we call the next method, the execution pauses at line number 3, returning an object having value 1 and done false. Now, if you call next again, what happens? The yield expression is evaluated and then this console.log will be executed and the execution pauses at line number 5, right? So if you see the output, you can see that value is 1. Let me save this. And you can see that value is 1 and done false. Since we didn't pass anything to this next, we get undefined and we get value 2 and done false. Now, instead of this next function, I'm using throw here. So when you use throw, from the post statement, which is the third statement, an error is thrown. Since an error is thrown, if you don't catch the error, nothing after will be executed. Now let's save this, and I'm not passing anything to the throw function, and let's see the behavior. You can see that an error is thrown, and since we didn't pass anything to the throw function, the error is undefined, but an error is thrown. Now let's pass a string here, save it, and you can see that uncaught error. And if you call the next method again and again, so this is the normal behavior when we have an error thrown and anything after that will not be executed. So save it, and you can see the behavior, nothing is executed. So when we use generator.throw, we have to catch the error inside the generator function. So we can add a try catch. Okay, now inside we can move all those things. And inside the catch block, we can just get the error. Okay. Now let's see what happens. You can see that we get from the first next call, we get value 1 and done false. And then we call throw, which means from this statement, an error is thrown. And since we have a catch block, the error is caught here and this is executed. That's why we get error and error. And then there is nothing to be executed. So it returns an object having value undefined and done true, which means the sequence is over. But we can add more yield here, yield 3. Now let's see what happens. In this case, you get value 3 and done false, which means from this statement, we get value 1 and done false. Then we called the throw. So from this statement, error is thrown and it ended the catch method, and this is executed and it comes and returns an object having value 3 and done false. Now the yield expression is not evaluated yet. It only happens on the next call. So I'm adding this. Now it is evaluated and we get value undefined and done true. So this is the working of generator.throw function. Now let's look at another use case of generator functions when we have multiple generator functions. So now let's create a third function which uses these two generator functions. Function test3, and we can just yield test1 and yield test2. And we can create a generator object from test3. Okay, so this time we will get a generator object from this test3, and let's see what happens when we call the next method. Now let's see the output. Here you can see that the value is test1 and done is false. Here test1 is the generator object from this function. So here we are yielding by calling test1. So test1 returns a generator object, and when we call the next method, that becomes the value of the value field. But what we need is it first sequentially execute this generator object, which means when we call the next method, we need an object having value 1. And what happens if when we call it again? This time we get the value as test2, which means this is the next generator function, this one. So when we execute this, we will get another generator object. This is not our expectation. So our expectation is we need first 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. Okay, so one way to do is that to use a for of loop here. So for, and here you can yield element, and similarly you can do for test2. So this time what happens? This time we can use for of loop with the generator object because generator objects are iterables. So we are calling test1 here, returning the generator object, and it iterates through that generator object, and on each value we are yielding it. Now let's see the behavior. So when we call generator.next now, you can see that we get value 1 and done false. So value 1 is from this. Okay, and now when we call it again, you get value 2 and done false. Okay, now let's repeat this 2 more times. You see value 1, value 2, value 3, value 4. Or if you just comment this, and let's just use a for of loop with this generator. You can see that we get 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so for this use case, we have another yield statement, a different yield statement. That is a yield followed by asterisk character. And here we can give test1. Okay, so if you see now the loop, you get 1 and 2. Okay, if you add the same with the test2, now when this is executed, you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's the use of the yield star expression. Now let's look at a confusing example. So here I have a generator function test and 3. So we have 3 yield expression with a value 3. We can create a generator object from this generator function. Okay, now so what happens when we call this next? Okay, you can see that this function is having only one statement, but that statement is having 3 yield expression. So in this scenario, it first comes to this yield expression. Okay, so the execution pauses at this statement, giving an object having value 3 and done false. Okay, so let's see. Let me save this. You can see that value 3 and done false. And what happens when we call the next again? So when we call the next again, what happens is that this yield expression which is paused will be evaluated with the passed value. If you are not passing anything, this yield expression will be evaluated to undefined, and that becomes the value of this yield expression. Okay, and it returns an object having value undefined and done false. You can see that value undefined and done false. But if you just pass a value here, what happens? This yield expression will be evaluated to this value, and here it will be yield 10. So we'll get an object with the value 10 and done false. Value 10 and done false. Similarly, again, when we call this, and if you pass 20, what happens? This yield expression will be evaluated to the value 20, and this become yield 20. So it returns an object having value 20 and done false, and the execution is still paused because this yield expression is not yet evaluated. Save this, you can see that value 20 and done false. Now if you call the next again, this yield expression is evaluated and the execution of the function is completed, then it returns an object having value undefined and done as true. Save this, you can see that value is undefined and done true. So what happens if you pass a value here? Do we get the value? No. So when we call this next function, the last yield expression, which is this one, will be evaluated to the passed value 30, but the function is not returning that value. Since we are not returning it, we will still get the value as undefined only. Which means if you just add a return statement, then you get a value of 30 and done as true. You can see that value of 30 and done true. Okay, let's take another example. So here, I'm just returning 3. So what happens when you call the next method? So this time, in this function, there is no yield statement. Okay, so it executes this third line and it returns an object having value 3 and done true. You can see that value is 3 and done true. Now what happens if you execute this again? You will get undefined and done as true. Okay. Now let's change this to yield 3. This time when we call the next, it first comes to this statement and we have a yield. So it returns an object having value 3 and done is false because this is a yield and the execution pauses at here. Okay, so save this and you can see that value is 3 and done is false. Now what happens if you call it again? Now we are calling the next and we are not passing anything. So this yield expression will be evaluated to undefined and undefined is returned. So an object having value undefined and done true will be returned. So you can see that value undefined and done true. Now if you just pass a value, so that value becomes the return value because this yield expression will be evaluated to 15 and that will be the return value and we will get value 15 and done true. Okay, I hope you understand everything about generator functions from this video. Thank you for watching.